I never thought my life's work would end with a signature on a single sheet of paper. For 20 years, I built a company with nothing but a rusted pickup truck, a second-hand desk, and an old coffee pot that never stopped dripping. That company became my second home. The walls smelled of sawdust and sweat, of dreams stitched together by long nights and missed dinners. Every deal I made, every sleepless night spent poring over contracts, every calloused handshake, I thought it was for the family I loved, for the son I raised, for the future I hoped he'd inherit. But then came the phone call, a nurse's voice trembling. My granddaughter, just 6 years old, had collapsed at school. Within hours, she was hooked to machines that beeped like they were keeping time with the last ounce of her childhood. I saw her small hand, pale against the sheets, and for the first time in decades, I felt helpless. The doctors spoke in numbers, in probabilities, in words that sounded like storms I couldn't stop. Treatment, surgery, weeks in the hospital, and behind every word hung a price tag so large it made my chest ache. Insurance wouldn't cover it all. My son and his wife, they didn't have enough savings. And so, the burden, the decision, fell on me. I sat at my desk, staring at the framed photo of my granddaughter, her gap-toothed smile lighting up the Christmas tree last winter. Next to it was a picture of the company's first truck, the same one I drove across state lines to deliver the very first order. One photo was a legacy. The other was life itself. When the banker slid the papers across the table, I hesitated. 20 years of sweat and sacrifice, reduced to numbers and ink. My thumb hovered above the pen. I thought of the nights I carried my son to bed after he'd fallen asleep on the couch, the way I whispered promises to him that I would build something strong, something he could stand on one day. I thought of the mornings I left before sunrise, kissing my wife on the forehead, whispering apologies I never had time to explain. And then I thought of that hospital room, of my granddaughter's fragile breath. The pen hit the paper. Just like that, I sold the company. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that no building, no contract, no ledger line was worth more than the heartbeat of a child. And for a moment, I felt proud. Proud that a father, a grandfather, could still matter in a world that often forgets the old. But what came next was the first shock. Instead of gratitude, instead of tears, or even a quiet embrace, my son looked at me with eyes I didn't recognize. Cold, calculating. "Dad," he said, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it, "that money was the company's, not yours. You had no right." No right, 2 words, but they cut deeper than any knife. I stared at him, this man who once sat on my shoulders at baseball games, who once cried into my chest when his first love broke his heart. And now he was telling me I had no right to sell the thing I built, the thing I bled for. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to tell him that every brick of that company was laid with my hands, every dollar earned came from nights I could have spent with him instead. But all I could do was whisper, "It was for your daughter." His jaw tightened. He didn't soften. He didn't bend. And in that moment, I realized something I never wanted to believe. Love, sacrifice, even blood itself, could be met not with gratitude but with betrayal. That night I sat alone in my kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. My hands trembled as I turned my wedding ring round and round, remembering the vow I once made to always protect my family. Was this protection or destruction? I had given up everything I'd built, not for myself but for them. And instead of a thank you, I was handed suspicion, resentment, maybe even greed. I thought of my granddaughter again, her small chest rising and falling against the weight of machines. She was the only reason I didn't regret that signature. But for the first time, a crack split through the foundation of what I thought family meant. I didn't know then that it was only the beginning. Because betrayal, like a storm, always starts with one crack in the sky. And I had just heard the first thunder. Before the company had a name, before the first paycheck cleared, there was only a man with a toolbox and a stubborn belief that hard work could bend the world. I remember the mornings that began not with sunlight, but with the grind of a worn-out alarm clock. Its buzz cut through the quiet like a saw. I would pull on my boots while the rest of the house still slept, the air in the kitchen heavy with the smell of last night's coffee that I hadn't bothered to pour out. In those days, money was thin as paper. We rented a 2-bedroom house where the roof leaked when it rained, and the heater coughed more than it warmed. But I carried in me a hunger that no bill collector could scare away. I told myself, if I build something with my own hands, Maybe my son will never feel this weight pressing on his chest. The work was brutal. Summers scorched the skin on my neck. Winters split the flesh of my fingers until they bled onto the wood and steel I shaped. My tools clattered like thunder in empty garages, in warehouses that smelled of oil and dust. The noise followed me home, ringing in my ears long after I set them down. Yet I never let myself quit, because each time my back screamed at me to stop, I thought of my boy. I thought of the sneakers I wanted to buy him so he wouldn't be the kid with holes in his shoes at school. I thought of the way his eyes lit up at the sight of an ice cream truck, and how I wanted to say yes without counting the quarters in my pocket. So I pressed on. Little by little, the jobs grew. What started as patching fences and fixing shutters turned into contracts, then warehouses, then a modest office that smelled of fresh paint and possibility. I still remember the day the sign went up. Just a plank of wood with my last name burned into it, hanging crooked on two rusty chains. But when the wind carried the scent of sawdust across that small parking lot, I felt like I had carved my family's future into the air itself. Customers came. Employees followed. They weren't just workers, they became family. We celebrated birthdays with sheet cakes and cheap candles, sang off-key, laughed until our stomachs hurt. We grieved together when one of us lost a parent, when another's marriage broke apart. That company wasn't just mine, it was ours. A home built not of walls, but of loyalty. Still, I never forgot why I started. Every night, no matter how late, I tried to make it home in time to see my son asleep in his bed. The soft rise and fall of his breathing reminded me why the grind was worth it. Sometimes I'd slip a small toy under his pillow, a fire truck, a baseball glove, little tokens of a promise I couldn't yet put into words. One day this will all be yours. But sacrifice has its own flavor. It tastes of reheated dinners, of birthdays missed, of my wife's sighs when she ate alone at the table. It smells like burnt coffee at 2 a.m. and gasoline on my hands when I finally rolled into bed. The truth is, I gave myself so completely to the dream of that company, to the dream of securing my son's tomorrow, that I rarely asked what it was costing us in the present. Yet I told myself it was the only way. A man provides. A man builds. A man shoulders the weight so his child won't have to. I believed it with every fiber of my being. Years passed, and the little house gave way to a bigger one. The leaky roof was replaced with shingles that held through every storm. My son grew taller, stronger. His laughter-filled rooms I could finally afford to furnish. There were Christmas mornings when I stood back and watched him tear into gifts piled higher than I ever knew as a child. His joy was fuel to me, more intoxicating than any success the company could offer. But there were moments, fleeting but sharp, when I saw something else in his eyes, a flicker of distance, a shadow of expectation rather than gratitude. I brushed it aside, convincing myself it was just the arrogance of youth, that time and maturity would smooth it out. I told myself he would one day look back and understand the price his father paid. Now, as I think about the path that led me here, the ink still drying on those sale papers, my son's cold words still echoing, I realize just how much of myself I poured into building not just a business, but a legacy. I carried the weight of storms so he could walk in sunlight. I bled so he could stand tall. I built walls so strong I thought they would shelter him forever, and maybe that was my mistake. Because walls can protect, yes, but they can also separate, and as much as I wanted to shield him, I wonder now if, brick by brick, I had built something that kept us apart. For all the growth the company saw, for all the contracts signed and machines bought, home was never as steady as I wanted it to be. Behind the polished numbers on invoices and the pride of a growing reputation, there were nights when we counted dollars at the kitchen table, the light bulb above us flickering as if it too was tired of holding on. Bills arrived like uninvited guests, loud, demanding, relentless. The envelope with the red stamp meant urgent sat like a bruise in the middle of the pile. The mortgage, the car repairs, the unexpected doctor's visits, they stacked higher than the paychecks I fought for. My wife used to press her hands against her temples as she sorted through the papers, the smell of ink and cheap paper filling the room. I can still see the crease between her brows, deepening with each calculation. Maybe if we cut back here, she'd whisper, her voice already worn thin, we can make it until next month. I wanted to tell her not to worry, that I had it under control, But the truth was, there were months when control slipped through my fingers like sand. Hardship doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It's the sound of shoes that are a size too small, the quiet complaint of a child rubbing at blisters after school. It's the way dinner plates hold portions that look generous in the dark but meager in daylight. It's the draft sneaking in through window frames we couldn't afford to fix, chilling the house no matter how many blankets we stacked on the beds. And yet, there was love. We laughed around that same wobbly kitchen table, even when dinner was little more than rice and beans. My wife would hum while she cooked, a melody carried from her own childhood, and somehow it made the air feel warmer. My son, oblivious to the math we were doing behind closed doors, told jokes he'd picked up from school, his laughter spilling into the small rooms like sunlight through thin curtains. It wasn't abundance, but it was life. I carried those images with me to work like talismans against despair. The sight of my son's messy hair at the breakfast table, the smell of my wife's bread cooling on the counter, the scrape of chairs across our worn linoleum floor, they reminded me why I endured. But hardship leaves marks. There were nights my wife sat on the porch long after the sun went down, arms folded tight, her gaze fixed on a horizon that never seemed to get closer. I would join her, both of us silent, listening to the cicadas cry into the summer heat. The silence wasn't peace. It was weight. The unspoken fear that no matter how much I worked, no matter how much we sacrificed, we might never escape the edge we balanced on. Sometimes I wondered if my son noticed more than I gave him credit for. He would come into the room when our voices rose, when tension cut sharper than any words we said. His eyes lingered, curious but cautious, as if he sensed the walls of his childhood weren't as unshakable as we wanted him to believe. One winter stands out in my memory like a scar. The furnace broke during the coldest week of January. The house smelled faintly of metal and smoke, but no heat came. We pulled mattresses into the living room, lit the fireplace, and slept in layers of sweaters and coats. My son pressed close between us, his cheeks flushed from the cold, his breath visible in the air. I told him it was an adventure, that we were camping indoors. He giggled, pretending to believe me. But when I turned away, I felt the sting of tears I couldn't allow to fall. That winter taught me something I never forgot. Hardship doesn't only test a man's back or wallet. It tests his heart. It asks how long you can keep pretending things will be fine, how convincingly you can wear hope like a mask. Through it all, I held onto the idea that one day, all of it would turn, that my son would grow up in a world sturdier than the one I had known, that he would never have to feel the chill of a broken furnace or the shame of second-hand shoes. That dream became the engine inside me. Even when I was bone-tired, when my knuckles cracked from work, when I sat awake at night listening to the wind push against the thin walls, I promised myself I would never let hardship define us. But hardship, it has a way of shaping you, whether you choose it or not. It leaves shadows, quiet and invisible, until one day they step into the light. And I would learn, years later, that the shadows I tried to carry alone had been seen by my son all along. It began with a phone call no one expects. I was in the office that morning, a stack of contracts in front of me, when the ringtone broke through the room, shrill, insistent, cutting sharper than the hum of the copier. My son's voice on the other end was rushed, almost foreign, trembling in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy. "Dad, it's Emily." She collapsed. "They're rushing her to the hospital." The papers on my desk blurred. My hand gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles whitened. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, as though someone had drawn it out with a vacuum. By the time I reached the hospital, the hallways smelled of antiseptic and overcooked coffee, the kind that sits too long on a hot plate. The fluorescent lights cast everything in an unnatural shade, pale and cold. Machines beeped in steady, indifferent rhythms, as if they cared only about numbers, not the little girl tangled in wires. There she was, my granddaughter, so small against the wide hospital bed. Her hair, once wild with curls, clung damp to her forehead. Her lips carried the faintest trace of blue. When I touched her hand, it was lighter than a bird's wing, fragile in a way that frightened me more than anything I had ever faced. The doctor spoke with the calm precision of a man who had given this speech too many times. He showed us scans, charts, data that might as well have been in another language. But one phrase cut through: "It will require long-term treatment." Surgery, medication, extended care. It won't be simple. Then came the words I dreaded even more, and it will be expensive. I felt my chest tighten, not in anger, not in disbelief, but in a grief so heavy it nearly bent me forward. I glanced at my son and his wife. Their faces carried the pale wash of fear. She clutched a tissue in both hands until it tore. He stood stiff, as though bracing against an invisible storm. The days that followed blurred into one another. Mornings and nights lost their boundaries inside those white walls. I learned to measure time by the shift changes of nurses, by the trays of bland food that appeared at predictable hours. Emily's room smelled faintly of plastic and bleach. The steady hum of machines became our soundtrack. At times, when the hallway quieted, I could hear the soft hiss of oxygen, the flutter of her shallow breaths. Each sound was both comfort and torment, proof she was still fighting, yet constant reminders of her fragility. I tried to be strong. I told stories by her bedside, my voice catching at the edges but steady enough to paint pictures of playgrounds and picnics. Sometimes, when her eyelids fluttered open, she gave me the faintest smile, one corner of her mouth lifting before exhaustion pulled her back under. Those tiny moments became treasure, fragile jewels I carried in my chest. But the numbers haunted me. Bills began to arrive, stacks of them, each envelope heavier than the last. The insurance covered some, but never enough. I overheard hushed conversations between my son and the billing office, his voice clipped, defensive, then quiet as though smothered by shame. At night, when I sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, the world smelled of reheated soup and disinfectant. I looked at the families around me, each trapped in their own private storm. I wondered if any of them had mortgaged their lives away, if any of them felt the same impossible equation between love and survival. There is a particular kind of pain in watching a child suffer, sharper than your own wounds, crueler than any burden you carry yourself. When my granddaughter winced in her sleep, her small body curling against the pain, I felt something in me fracture. I wanted to trade places, to lift every needle, every pill, every surgery from her body and carry it in mine. But all I could do was sit in that stiff chair, the smell of latex gloves and alcohol stinging my nose, and hold her hand as though my grip alone could keep her tethered here. My wife came often, her presence quiet but grounding. She brought homemade soup in thermoses, though the nurses politely shook their heads. She sat beside me, her hand on mine, both of us watching the rise and fall of our granddaughter's chest like it was the only thing that mattered in the world. One night, long after visiting hours, I stood at the window outside Emily's room. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass, a blur of red taillights and neon signs. Life went on out there, people laughing in restaurants, rushing home from work, children playing video games on glowing screens. And here we were, our world shrunk to the square footage of a hospital room, our lives balanced on the fragile rhythm of one little girl's breathing. It was in that silence, with my forehead pressed against the cool glass, that the decision began to take root inside me. I had built a company from sweat and sacrifice. I had turned nothing into something. But as I stood there, I knew deep down that all of it might have to be given up. Because when the weight of survival rests on a child's chest, what is a company worth? The hospital became a second home, though no one would ever choose to live there. Its walls were too white, its lights too harsh, its air too sterile to belong to life as we knew it. But that was where I found myself day after day, carrying the weight of a decision that gnawed at me until sleep became impossible. The doctors had laid out a path for Emily, treatments, surgeries, medications, therapies. Each one vital, each one carrying a price that climbed higher than anything we could reach. The figures were not abstract anymore. They were written on paper, circled in red, placed in my hands as though daring me to find a way. I carried those papers home one night. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the old floorboards under my boots. I spread the bills across the kitchen table, their edges overlapping like puzzle pieces that refused to fit. The numbers stared back, sharp and unyielding. My wife sat across from me, her fingers wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. She didn't speak, but her eyes held the question we both feared to voice. What now? I pressed my palms against the wood, felt the grooves worn into its surface over years of family meals and arguments and late-night talks. The table had seen our struggles before, but never like this. Never something that asked for more than we thought we could give. And then, without meaning to, my eyes wandered to the framed photograph on the wall, our family gathered years ago in front of the company sign. My son had been young then, his arms slung around my shoulder, grinning with a pride I thought would last forever. That company had been my life's work. Every nail hammered, every contract signed, every risk taken, it was all for the promise that one day he would carry it forward, that the company would not only feed our family but define us. Now, it was no longer about legacy. It was about survival. I drove to the office the next morning before the sun rose, the sky still ink dark, the streets slick from a night of rain. The building loomed ahead, quiet and familiar, its windows reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. I sat in the parking lot, engine running, staring at the place that had once been my dream. Inside, everything smelled of the usual mix of paper, oil, and coffee. Desks stood neatly arranged, blueprints rolled into tubes, binders stacked high with plans. I walked the halls slowly, running my hand along the cool plaster of the walls. Every corner of that place carried a memory, the sound of laughter after a big contract, the buzz of saws from our first workshop, the nervous silence before payroll meetings when money was tight. I paused at my office door. The brass plate with my name glinted under the ceiling light. My hand lingered on the knob, heavy, reluctant. When I finally stepped inside, I sat at my desk and let the silence surround me. The leather of my chair creaked as I leaned back. From the window, I could see the faintest line of dawn breaking through the horizon, washing the sky in bruised shades of purple and gold. It felt like a reckoning. The decision formed slowly, like water dripping until it fills a basin. Part of me fought it, clinging to the years I had spent building something from nothing. Another part, the louder part, reminded me of Emily's hand in mine, her pulse so faint it frightened me. I opened a drawer and pulled out a yellowed ledger from the company's early years. The ink was faded, the handwriting uneven, but it told the story of survival, weeks when the profit margin was nothing, months when I barely scraped enough to keep the lights on. I had built this once. I had let it go and rebuild again and again through failure and fire. But I could not rebuild a life lost. That was the truth I could no longer escape. By the time I called the banker, my voice was steady though my heart rattled in my chest. I told him I was ready to discuss selling. There was a pause on the other end, the kind reserved for moments when even a professional struggles to hide surprise. We met 2 days later. The office smelled faintly of polished wood and the cologne of men who measured worth in numbers. Papers were placed before me, pages thick with legal language that turned flesh and blood into assets and liabilities. As I held the pen, I felt the weight of 2 decades pressing against me. The memory of sleepless nights, of celebrations in break rooms, of sweat staining the collar of my shirts, all of it balanced on the edge of that signature. My hand trembled. I thought of Emily's face, pale but still angelic, even under hospital lights. I thought of her laugh when she chased bubbles in the yard last summer, the sound so pure it seemed to catch the sunlight itself. And with that memory burning inside me, I pressed the pen to paper. Ink spread across the page, final and irreversible. The company was no longer mine. I set the pen down, my fingers stiff, my breath shallow, the room around me blurred. All I could hear was the faint scratch of paper against wood as the banker gathered the documents, his voice reciting the formalities I barely registered. In that moment, I felt both empty and resolute. A man stripped of his life's work, yet unwilling to let go of the life that mattered most. I had made the choice, but I could not have known then that the sacrifice meant to save would also uncover something darker, something I had never imagined waiting in the shadows of my own family. I expected silence when I told him, maybe tears, maybe gratitude so overwhelming it would leave us both wordless. But I didn't expect what I heard. We were sitting in the hospital cafeteria, the kind of place where the smell of burnt coffee and reheated casseroles lingers no matter how often they mop the floors. The hum of vending machines filled the pauses between our words. Nurses in scrubs passed by, their shoes squeaking faintly against linoleum, lives rushing on while ours felt suspended in a fragile bubble. I told him then with my voice low, almost careful as though it might shatter if I spoke too loud. I sold the company. Emily's treatments are covered. For a moment he froze. His spoon hovered above the bowl of soup he hadn't touched. His face was unreadable, pale under the fluorescent lights. Then his eyes sharpened and his jaw set in a way I had never seen before. "You what?" I repeated myself, slower this time, my chest tight but proud. "I sold it. 20 years, it's done. She'll have everything she needs now." I expected relief to wash over him. Instead, his expression twisted, not into gratitude but into anger. "You had no right," he snapped. The words hit harder than any blow. "That wasn't just your decision. That company was supposed to be mine one day. Do you understand what you've done?" The sound around me seemed to fade. The cafeteria chatter, the clink of trays, the hum of the machines, all of it dulled to a ringing in my ears. "No right," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward, his hands flat against the table. His knuckles were white. "You should have talked to me. We could have found another way. You just threw away the future for all of us without even asking." I stared at him, at the son I had carried on my shoulders to ball games, the boy who once clung to my hand crossing streets. Now his eyes burned with accusation, not love. "I didn't throw it away," I said. "I gave it up for your daughter, for her life." But he shook his head, his mouth curling with something bitter. "You think you're a hero, but what you did was reckless. That company wasn't just yours anymore. It was the family's. It was mine." The word mine hung between us like poison. I sat back, the chair groaning under my weight, my stomach knotting so tightly it hurt to breathe. My fingers trembled against the table, brushing against the cool surface as if anchoring me to reality. I wanted to believe I'd misheard him, that grief had twisted his words. But the look in his eyes was clear, sharp, unyielding, and filled not with sorrow but resentment. For the first time in my life, I didn't recognize my own son. His wife appeared then, sliding into the seat beside him, her perfume sharp against the sterile cafeteria air. She placed a hand on his arm, a gesture that might have been meant to calm him, though her gaze toward me was cold, calculating. "Maybe he's right," she said softly, though her tone carried an edge. "That company could have supported us all. We could have managed the bills some other way. Selling it, it feels like you didn't trust us to handle things." Her words landed like stones. I looked between them, the boy I raised and the woman who now seemed to feed the fire in his chest, and I felt something inside me unravel. "You think this was about trust?" My voice cracked. "I trusted that company with 20 years of my life. I trusted it would provide for you. And when Emily needed more than any of us could give, I trusted myself to act before it was too late." But my son shook his head again, dismissive. His lips pressed thin. "You should have trusted me." Silence stretched. The cafeteria noise crept back in, the hiss of steam from the coffee machine, the chatter of a nearby table, but it all felt distant, unreal. I studied his face, searching for the boy I once knew. The one who cried when his kite broke in half. The one who hugged me so tightly after his first home run that I thought he'd never let go. But that boy wasn't here. In his place sat a man consumed not by fear for his daughter, but by anger over what I had taken from him. I felt heat rise in my chest, not the kind that fuels anger, but the kind that burns with grief. My throat tightened, my hands shook. I wanted to shout, to slam my fist against the table and remind him who had built that company brick by brick, who had sacrificed nights and years so he could stand tall. But all I managed was a single sentence, heavy and trembling. "I did it for her, for Emily." His reply was quick, sharp as glass. "And you did it against me." Those words split me open. I sat there, hollowed, the cafeteria lights buzzing above us, my soup untouched and growing cold. The moment I thought would unite us as father and son had instead carved a chasm wider than I knew how to cross. And somewhere, in the sterile quiet of a hospital room, a little girl slept, unaware that the fight for her life had already torn our family apart. I thought the sting of my son's words would fade with time, but it didn't. In the days after our conversation in the cafeteria, I tried to convince myself it was grief speaking, or stress, or the kind of anger that comes when life feels out of control. I told myself that deep down, he understood why I did it, that one day when the storm of fear around his daughter had quieted, he would thank me. But the storm only grew darker. It happened late one evening at the hospital. I had gone to fetch coffee, though it tasted like little more than warm water tinged with bitterness. The halls were quieter than usual, the night shift moving slower, voices hushed, footsteps softened by fatigue. When I returned, I slowed as I reached the doorway of the family lounge. The light inside spilled dimly into the corridor, a muted yellow glow. I heard voices. My son's low and sharp and his wife's smoother but edged with steel. I should have walked away, but something in his tone froze me in place. "She doesn't need all of it," he said. His voice was tight, pressed low so as not to carry, but clear enough that I caught every syllable. "She's your daughter," his wife whispered back. "Of course she needs it." "No, listen." A pause, a scrape of chair legs against tile. "The hospital bills won't take everything, not if we're smart. Dad signed over more than enough. We can keep the rest." My chest clenched. The rest. I pressed myself against the wall, the cool paint cold against my back, my coffee trembling in my hand until the lid rattled. His wife sighed. "You mean use it for us?" "Yes, for once for us. We've been waiting years and now it's here. We can finally buy that house. Start the life we've been planning. Dad will never know the difference." The lounge fell quiet for a moment. I could hear only the hum of the vending machine, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then she spoke again, softly, almost like a test. "And what if he asks? What if he finds out?" "He won't," my son said. "He's too blinded by Emily. He thinks he's the savior, the martyr. He'll never question it, and by the time he does, it'll be too late." The words cut through me like shards of glass. Blinded, martyr. This was my son. The boy I had carried on my shoulders, the man I thought I was saving by giving him everything. And here he was, planning not just to take my sacrifice, but to twist it into greed. My hands shook so violently that hot coffee spilled down my wrist. The sting barely registered. My throat closed as I fought back the urge to storm into that room, to demand an explanation, to shake sense back into the child I once knew. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I stood there, frozen in the half-light of the corridor, listening as they plotted the future with money I had bled my life into earning, money I had surrendered for the life of a little girl who was fighting for every breath. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure, as if everything I had done, every sacrifice, every dream, was nothing more than a vault they now had the key to. When their voices finally fell silent, I slipped away, steps heavy, coffee cup abandoned in the trash. The hallway stretched long and sterile, its pale walls closing in like a tunnel. By the time I reached Emily's room, my chest ached with a pain that felt older than my bones. She lay there, her small chest rising and falling, machines blinking like indifferent stars around her bed. I pulled a chair close and sat down, my head in my hands. The smell of antiseptic clung to my clothes, sharp and unforgiving. I looked at her, innocent, unknowing, and I whispered words I couldn't say to anyone else. "They don't see you, sweetheart. They don't see what matters, but I do. I always will." That night, something inside me broke. Not the kind of break that heals with time, but the kind that changes a man forever. I realized then that my son wasn't just ungrateful. He wasn't just angry. He was willing to turn my sacrifice into profit, to build his own comfort on the back of his daughter's illness. And in that realization, a new resolve began to form, as sharp and unyielding as the pain in my chest. If he thought I was blind, if he thought I would let him take what I had given for her, then he did not know me at all. I would not shout. I would not beg. I would not even confront him yet. But I would act, because the man who built an empire from nothing still lived in me. And I would not let my granddaughter's fight for life become his path to greed. Once you hear the truth spoken in hushed tones, it never leaves you. It follows you like a whisper crawling through the dark, even when the house is silent. After that night in the hospital corridor, I knew what had to be done. I could no longer afford to hope that my son's anger was fleeting or that gratitude might one day bloom in its place. I had heard his plan with my own ears, and so, quietly, without announcement, I began my own. The first step was simple. I listened. Every conversation became a map. In the lounge, in the hallways, even during the drive home from the hospital, I kept my ears tuned to the rhythm of his words. I noticed the phrases he repeated, the pauses when money came up, the way his wife leaned closer when numbers slipped into the discussion. They thought their voices were low enough to vanish into the hum of hospital machines, but to me, each word rang louder than any alarm. I began carrying a small recorder. It fit neatly in my pocket, light enough to forget but powerful enough to catch every murmur. I left it running in the family lounge when I excused myself for coffee. I placed it on the dashboard during late-night drives when tension boiled between them. The first time I played it back, I sat alone in my car, parked beneath a dim streetlight. Their voices spilled through the tiny speaker, his sharp, her smoother but coaxing, discussing allocations, leftover funds, opportunities. The words tasted sour in my mouth, each one confirming the betrayal I had once prayed I imagined. The night air was cool, but sweat gathered on my neck as I listened. The dashboard glowed faintly with the green digits of the clock, marking each passing second of their greed. Next, I turned to paper. Bank statements, transaction histories. I requested copies under the guise of helping with hospital finances. The envelopes arrived sealed, ordinary, but inside they held stories, money moving in ways that didn't belong, small transfers dressed up as routine expenses. I laid them out across my desk at home, the lamplight staining the pages in amber. Lines of numbers ran like veins, and I traced them with my finger until patterns emerged. I circled dates, amounts, names. With each stroke of my pen, I felt the outline of their scheme grow clearer, like a shadow sharpening into form. I didn't stop there. At the hospital, I befriended a clerk in billing. She was young, tired, her desk cluttered with files and a cup of tea long since cooled. I asked gentle questions, careful not to reveal too much. She told me things without realizing their weight, who had called to ask about balances, who had pressed about insurance reimbursements, who seemed more interested in timing than treatment. Each piece slid into place like fragments of glass forming a window. Through it, I saw them more clearly than ever before. The hardest part was carrying all this knowledge in silence. There were nights when I wanted to storm into their home, slam the papers on the table and demand, "Explain this, explain yourselves." But I knew rage would only push them deeper into secrecy, make them cautious, erase the trail I needed. So I endured. At family dinners, I sat across from them, listening to the scrape of forks on plates, watching the flicker of candlelight across their guarded faces. My son laughed at something trivial, his wife offered polite remarks. But beneath the small talk, I heard echoes of the recordings in my pocket. Every smile they gave me was a mask, and I learned to wear one too. But masks are heavy. I lay awake many nights, the ceiling fan turning slow circles above me, shadows stretching across the walls. My chest tightened with the weight of secrets, with the image of Emily sleeping in that hospital bed, unaware of the war building around her. I reminded myself why I was doing this. Not for revenge, not yet, but for protection, for truth. For the day when light would cut through the lies, when every word they whispered would stand against them. The evidence grew. Recordings, documents, notes in my own handwriting, dated and signed so no detail could slip away. I stored them in a locked drawer, the key kept on a chain around my neck. And still I said nothing. To them I remained the weary grandfather, worried for his granddaughter, grateful for their help. I let them believe I was blind, that I was too old, too broken, too consumed with fear to notice. But behind my silence a storm gathered, because the man they thought was blinded by sacrifice was, in truth, watching more closely than ever. And when the time came, I would not simply confront them. I would reveal them. The hardest part of deception is not in hiding your own truth, it's in letting others believe theirs. By the time I had gathered enough recordings, statements, and whispers to see their intentions clearly, I understood that simply confronting them would not be enough. Words could be twisted, tears could be staged, but numbers left trails. If my son wanted money, I would give him the chance to reach for it. And when he did, his hand would close not on inheritance, but on a snare of his own making. I began quietly with conversations that sounded harmless. One afternoon, as we sat in Emily's hospital room, sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, striping the floor in pale gold. She slept, her breath soft, her body wrapped in blankets patterned with cartoon animals. I leaned toward my son and said, "The sale cleared. The funds are in place. I can't manage it all myself, not with everything happening here. Maybe you could help with some of the paperwork." His eyes flickered, the faintest spark. He masked it quickly, but I had seen it, the glint of hunger dressed as responsibility. He nodded, his tone calm. "Of course, Dad, let me take care of that for you. You shouldn't be worrying about the details right now." The words were meant to soothe, but beneath them I heard the sound of a lock clicking open on a vault he thought was his. Over the next days I laid breadcrumbs, small mentions of accounts, references to leftover funds after the first round of hospital bills. Each time I watched his posture shift, his gaze sharpen, his fingers drum lightly on the table as though calculating before speaking. I let him believe I was weary, distracted, too consumed by fear for my granddaughter to notice. I left a folder of statements deliberately visible on my desk, its corners slightly askew as though forgotten in haste. When I returned later and saw it moved, papers stacked differently, a page slightly bent, I knew he had peeked. But suspicion alone was not enough. I needed proof. I went to the bank under the guise of setting up a trust for Emily. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of polished metal and ink. The banker, a man I'd known for years, listened carefully as I laid out my request. I wanted an account, accessible but monitored, one that would record every movement, every attempt to withdraw beyond what was necessary. A trap made not of steel but of signatures. He hesitated at first, eyebrows raised, but when I leaned forward and said, "This is not just about money, it's about protecting what was meant for my granddaughter," he nodded slowly, understanding. Together we drafted papers that looked ordinary but carried teeth. Withdrawals required co-signatures, transfers triggered alerts, and still to the untrained eye it looked like opportunity waiting to be seized. When I handed the documents to my son later that week, the ink still fresh, I spoke with deliberate weariness. "These accounts should be managed properly," I said, sliding them across the table. "I'm too old for all this. You're better with computers, with numbers. I trust you." The word trust hung in the air like bait. He hesitated, then reached for the papers, his fingers grazing the edges. "Don't worry, Dad, I'll handle it." I studied his face in that moment. Calm, practiced, but the corner of his mouth betrayed him. It lifted almost imperceptibly in satisfaction. That night, I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet except for the faint tick of the clock on the dresser. My chest was heavy, not only with sorrow but with anticipation. I had placed the pieces where they needed to be. Now all that remained was to wait. Would he take the bait quickly, or would he move with caution, testing the waters first? Either way, the moment he acted, the record would be there, ink on paper, numbers in ledgers, his choices carved where no denial could erase them. A week later the call came. The banker's voice was clipped, professional, but I could hear the weight beneath his words. "There's been an attempted transfer, significant, not for medical expenses. The system flagged a forged authorization. Nothing has left the account." I closed my eyes, my hand gripping the receiver until my knuckles ached. I asked for the details, the date, the amount. The signature not in my hand but in his. It was done, not the theft itself but the proof of his intent. I drove to the hospital that evening, the streets bathed in the orange glow of sunset. My son greeted me in the corridor, his smile practiced, his tone warm. He spoke of Emily's progress, of doctor's plans, his words carefully chosen to sound responsible. But I saw past them. Because now, behind every syllable, I heard the echo of the bank's report. I felt the weight of the folder tucked safely at home, filled with evidence he didn't know I had. He thought the vault was open. He thought he was clever. But what he didn't know was that every step he had taken was into a trap I had built with the same patience I once used to build an empire. And just as before, I was willing to wait until the right moment came to reveal everything. Families don't always break with shouting. Sometimes they fracture quietly, in glances that last too long, in silences that grow too wide to cross. After the failed transfer at the bank, I carried the knowledge like a hidden wound. I went about each day with the same practiced calm, visiting Emily, checking on her treatments, sharing polite conversations, but beneath it all, I knew my son's hands had already reached for what wasn't his. And slowly, the ripple began to spread. It started with small things. My eldest daughter came to see Emily one afternoon. The hospital room smelled faintly of soap and fresh linens, the blinds half drawn against a sun too bright for such a place. She sat at the edge of the bed, stroking her niece's hair, but her eyes kept drifting toward me. "Dad," she said carefully, as though measuring every word, "Michael says you're not handling the money right, that you're too emotional to make these decisions alone." Her voice trembled, caught between concern and suspicion. I felt a chill run through me. My son's words had already spread beyond closed doors. He was planting seeds, seeds of doubt, painting me not as protector but as liability. I asked her quietly, "And do you believe him?" She looked down, fingers tightening on Emily's blanket. "I don't know what to believe anymore." The fracture widened at family dinners. We gathered at my house on Sundays as we always had. The table was set with familiar dishes, the smell of roast chicken, the steam from mashed potatoes, the tang of pickles in small glass bowls. Yet the air was thick, not with warmth but with tension. My son spoke often, his voice carrying easily, his words rehearsed. He talked about responsibility, about transparency, about how the family needed to be united in decisions. His wife nodded along, her smile polite but edged with something sharper. Others listened, some nodding slowly, others looking at me with hesitant eyes. I sat at the head of the table, the place I had always taken without question. But now it felt less like a seat of honor and more like a target. Every word I spoke was weighed, every pause interpreted. When I said, "The bills are covered, Emily will have what she needs," I saw my second son exchange a glance with Michael as if to say, "Can we trust him?" The meal tasted of ash in my mouth. Even my wife, once my steady anchor, seemed torn. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the world outside slept, she would turn to me in bed, her face pale in the dim light. "Maybe," she whispered, "you should involve them more. There are children too. Maybe you're carrying too much alone." Her hand rested on mine, warm but uncertain. She wasn't accusing, not yet, but doubt had found its way even into her. I wanted to tell her everything, that I had the recordings, the bank statements, the proof of betrayal, but I swallowed the words. It wasn't time. If I revealed too soon, they would deny, twist, erase. I needed the truth to stand undeniable, not just to me, but to all of them. And so I bore her doubt in silence. The worst moment came one afternoon when I arrived at the hospital to find my son already in the room with his siblings. He stood tall, his hand resting lightly on the betrayal, his voice smooth. "Dad means well," he was saying, "but he's overwhelmed. He doesn't see the big picture. If we don't step in, the money could vanish. And then what happens to Emily?" His words were knives disguised as concern. When I entered, the room fell silent. My other children avoided my gaze, shuffling, adjusting coats, smoothing hair. My son looked at me with the faintest smirk, as though daring me to contradict him. I felt the air thicken, the smell of disinfectant stinging my nose, the rhythmic beeping of the monitor filling the silence where trust used to live. From that day on, the family felt split down invisible lines. Some leaned toward him, convinced by his calm assurances. Others stayed near me, their faith unshaken but their eyes clouded with confusion. The house I had once imagined as unshakable, a family bound together by love and sacrifice, now felt like it was tilting, its foundation cracking beneath quiet arguments and unspoken suspicions. I moved through it carefully, choosing my words with the precision of a man navigating a minefield. I kissed my granddaughter's forehead each night, her skin warm beneath my lips, and told myself she was the reason I endured. But deep inside, I felt the fracture spreading, each day carving me further from the children I once believed would stand at my side without question. And though I remained silent, though I let the mask stay on my face, I knew what was coming. The family was no longer whole, the trap was set, and soon the truth would demand to be seen. The thing about traps is that they don't need to snap shut all at once. Sometimes the power is in letting the prey walk deeper, believing the ground is still safe beneath their feet. By now, my son had convinced himself the money was his to manage. His voice grew bolder, his posture more assured. He spoke as though decisions had already passed into his hands, as though I had quietly stepped aside. And I let him believe it. One evening, we met at my house. The others had gone home from the hospital for a night of rest, and it was just the two of us in the kitchen. The clock ticked steadily above the doorway, the faint smell of onions and garlic still lingering from a stew my wife had cooked earlier. I poured him a glass of water, slid it across the table, and laid out a folder of papers, not the originals, copies carefully arranged. "These are the upcoming expenses," I said, my tone weary, almost resigned. "I can't keep track of it all, you should review them." His eyes darted across the pages, scanning, calculating. I watched his pupils narrow, the corner of his mouth twitch. This is a lot of money sitting idle," he said at last. "If we don't act wisely, it'll disappear faster than you think." I nodded slowly, feigning agreement. "Then maybe you should handle the transfers. You're more capable with that sort of thing." His shoulders straightened, pride filling the space between us. He believed he had finally won my trust. But what he didn't know was that every page before him had been marked, every path leading to the account that was rigged to record his hand in the cookie jar. Days passed. He grew more confident, more careless. At family gatherings, he spoke with authority, discussing allocations and strategies as though he were the patriarch now. His siblings listened, some nodding, some uneasy, while I remained quiet, letting the silence stretch around him. Meanwhile, my folder grew heavier. Bank alerts, duplicate statements, signed authorizations bearing his name. My desk became an archive of his undoing, each paper a stone added to the wall closing in around him. At night, I spread them out under the lamplight, the ink glowing dark and sharp against the pale paper. My hands traced the evidence, my breath steady. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, it was sorrow. Every signature was a reminder of how far he had drifted, how willingly he had chosen this path. The turning point came one afternoon in the hospital. Emily was asleep, her chest rising gently beneath her blanket, the soft whoosh of oxygen filling the room. My son leaned against the window, arms folded, speaking in a low voice. "I'm moving the funds," he whispered to his wife. "Dad won't even notice when I slip it past him. It'll all be ours." He didn't realize I was standing in the doorway. For a moment the air between us froze. The light through the blinds cut stripes across his face, shadow and brightness dividing him down the middle. I didn't move, didn't speak, just turned away, footsteps slow, deliberate. I didn't need his whispered boasts to confirm anything. I already had the bank's alerts, the forged authorization, the proof inked where no denial could erase it. But now I had something else, the certainty that he believed himself untouchable, and that belief would make the final reveal undeniable. At home, I called the banker again. We arranged the final piece, a detailed report of every attempt, every irregular transaction, each one tied directly to his signature. The folder grew thicker, heavier, until it felt less like paper and more like a verdict waiting to be read. I slid the documents into a sealed envelope, locked it away in the drawer I had used for years to keep family heirlooms. The same drawer where I once kept my son's childhood drawings, folded with pride. Now beside them lay the proof of his betrayal. The contrast nearly broke me, but grief had no place now. The time for silence was ending. The trap had been sprung, its jaws closed, not with noise, but with the quiet inevitability of truth recorded and preserved. Soon, there would be no more whispers, no more lies hidden in the folds of family dinners or hospital hallways. Soon, every page would see the light, and when it did, the family he had tried to turn against me would see him not as savior, not as victim, but as the man who betrayed his own blood. The night I chose was a Sunday. For years, Sundays had been sacred, our ritual of gathering, of breaking bread, of reminding ourselves that no matter how hard the world outside pressed in here at this table, we belonged to one another. But this Sunday was different. The house smelled of rosemary and roasted chicken, yet beneath it lingered something heavier, the weight of truth, sealed in the envelope tucked inside my jacket pocket. I set the table as I always had. Plates polished, glasses aligned, candles lit at the center. The flicker of flame threw shadows against the walls, stretching long and restless. My hands moved with practiced ease, but my chest thudded with a rhythm I couldn't calm. This was not just dinner. This was judgment night. They arrived as the sky turned violet, the last traces of sunlight spilling across the windows. My eldest daughter carried a pie, her smile thin. My younger son brought a bottle of wine, holding it like a peace offering. And then came Michael and his wife, arm in arm, their laughter soft but rehearsed, as though they were actors entering a stage. We sat. The scrape of chairs against wood sounded louder than usual. For a while, the air was filled with the clink of silverware. The muted thud of dishes passed hand to hand. Conversation hovered around safe topics, the weather, a neighbor's new car, Emily's progress. But beneath it, tension thrummed like a low drumbeat. I watched them carefully, each face lit by candlelight. My wife's eyes darted between me and Michael. My eldest son leaned back, arms crossed, already uneasy. And Michael, ever confident, held court at the table, speaking of responsibility, of future planning, tone smooth, persuasive. It was the same speech I'd heard before, but tonight it would not go unanswered. Halfway through the meal, I set down my fork. The sound of metal on porcelain rang sharp. The table stilled. "There's something I need to share," I said. My voice was calm, but the room tightened instantly. Every eye turned to me, the candle flames trembling in the draft of silence. Michael gave a polite smile. "Of course, Dad, go ahead." I reached into my jacket, fingers brushing against the rough edge of the envelope. I laid it gently on the table, the paper stark and pale against the dark wood. "This," I said slowly, "is what has been happening behind closed doors." For a moment no one moved. Then I slid the envelope across, its weight undeniable. My eldest daughter's hand trembled as she lifted the flap. Pages spilled out, statements, authorizations, bank alerts, each stamped with dates and signatures. The sound of paper rustling filled the room, sharp and relentless. "What is this?" my younger son muttered, scanning a page. My eldest daughter's eyes widened. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Michael, this is your name." The room erupted, not with shouting but with disbelief. Murmurs layered over each other, chairs scraping as bodies shifted. My wife's hand flew to her mouth, her face pale in the candlelight. And then at last all eyes turned to him. Michael leaned back, his smile gone, his face shadowed. "This is twisted," he said quickly, his voice sharp but unsteady. "He's trying to frame me. He's confused. You all know he's been under pressure, making mistakes. This is just another one." But his words fell heavy, unconvincing. I reached again into my jacket. This time I placed a small recorder on the table. With a single click the room filled with his voice, low, conspiratorial, unmistakable. "I'm moving the funds. Dad won't even notice. It'll all be ours." The words, once whispered in a hospital room, now echoed in front of everyone. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. I spoke then, steady and unyielding. "Confused men don't record conversations. They don't set safeguards at the bank. They don't keep copies of every transaction. But I did, and all of it leads back to you." Silence followed, broken only by the faint crackle of candle wicks. My younger son looked down at the papers again, shaking his head. "Michael, these are your signatures, your transfers." My eldest daughter's voice trembled with hurt. "You told me Dad was wasting the money. You lied to me." The walls of his confidence began to crumble. His wife's hand slipped from his arm. His eyes darted from one sibling to another, searching for a lifeline, but none came. The truth lay naked on the table, impossible to deny. I watched him struggle, my heart heavy. I had not wanted it to end like this, with my family fractured in the glow of candlelight. But betrayal, once revealed, cannot be folded neatly away. I leaned forward, my voice low but cutting through the tension. "You tried to take what was never yours. You tried to turn your brothers and sisters against me. You gambled with your daughter's life for your own comfort, and tonight everyone knows it." The room was still. The candle flame swayed, and in that silence the trap finally closed. For a long moment, no one breathed. The only sound was the faint hiss of wax as a drop slid down the side of a candle, landing with a soft pop on the tablecloth. The papers lay scattered across the wood, black ink stark against white pages, each one shouting the truth louder than any words I could have spoken. Michael's eyes darted wildly, searching the table for an escape. His siblings' faces were turned toward him now, not toward me. Their disbelief had hardened into something colder, betrayal recognized, trust collapsing like a house of cards. He opened his mouth, but his voice faltered. This isn't what it looks like." My eldest daughter slammed her palm down on the table, the sound sharp enough to make the glasses tremble. "Your name is everywhere," she shouted. Her eyes glistened, her chest rising and falling in quick bursts. "You lied to me. You lied to all of us." He pushed back his chair abruptly, the legs screeching against the floor. He stood tall, trying to summon the authority he once carried so easily. His face flushed red, his jaw tight. "You've all been manipulated," he said, his finger stabbing the air toward me. "He set me up. He's been planning this, waiting for me to slip, twisting everything so you'd all turn against me." But his words carried no weight anymore. The evidence lay bare before them, and the tone in his voice was no longer steady. It cracked at the edges, sharp with panic. His wife sat rigid, her hand gripping her wine glass so tightly her knuckles were pale. She looked down at the table, avoiding his eyes. "Say something," he hissed at her, but she said nothing. The silence of her refusal hit him harder than any accusation. His bravado cracked, his shoulders sagged, his eyes wild. "You don't understand," he said, his words tumbling faster now. "Desperate, I was trying to protect us. I thought if I handled the money differently we could have something left. I didn't mean—" My younger son cut him off, his voice low but steady. "You didn't mean to steal, you didn't mean to lie, you didn't mean to betray your own father, your own daughter." The words landed heavy and Michael flinched as if struck. I sat in silence, watching, my hands folded in my lap. For years, I had been the voice at this table, guiding, correcting, comforting. Tonight, I let the truth speak for itself. My eldest daughter shoved the papers toward him, the edges scraping across the wood. "Look at it. These are your signatures, your transfers, your voice on those recordings. How dare you stand here and blame him after everything he gave up?" Michael's face twisted, torn between anger and shame. His lips trembled as he tried to form another defense, but no words came. His throat worked, his breath shallow. He looked around the table at his brothers, his sisters, his mother, but found no rescue. One by one, their eyes turned away. The humiliation was not in the papers alone. It was in the stillness that followed, in the way the family he had tried to sway now leaned away from him, their bodies angled as if distance might protect them from the weight of his choices. His wife set her glass down at last. The sound of it touching the table was small but final. She looked at him, her eyes cold. "I can't defend this." The words drained the last of his strength. His shoulders slumped, his gaze dropped. For the first time in years, I saw not the man he had become, but the boy I once carried, the boy who had lost his way so completely he no longer recognized the road home. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, though I did not let them fall. I had set the trap. I had laid out the truth. But watching my own son collapse under the weight of it was a wound deeper than any betrayal. He sank back into his chair, his hands covering his face. His chest heaved, a sound breaking from him that was half sob, half growl. The fire of his defiance had gone out, leaving only the smoke of shame. No one spoke, no one moved. The candles flickered, shadows trembling across the walls as though even the house itself recoiled from the scene. At last I rose from my seat. The wood creaked beneath me and the room seemed to lean in, waiting. I looked at him, my voice steady though my heart trembled. "You wanted to take what was never yours. You wanted to make me the fool. But tonight the truth spoke louder than both of us. And now it belongs to everyone here." He lowered his hand slowly, his face blotched with red, his eyes hollow. There was no answer left in him. The humiliation was complete, not by my hand but by his own. Michael sat slumped in his chair, his hands pressed to his face as if he could hide from the truth lying bare on the table. The glow of the candles painted his skin in uneven tones, red where anger still lingered, pale where shame had drained him. His shoulders shook, the steady rise and fall of a man who could no longer keep his composure. The family watched in silence. No one rushed to comfort him. The room felt heavy, saturated with the smell of roasted meat gone cold, of wax melting into small pools beside the candles. The feast that had once been a symbol of unity now looked abandoned, plates half full, glasses smudged with fingerprints. He lowered his hand slowly, revealing eyes rimmed with red. Voice came out rough, almost unrecognizable. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." No one answered. His words hung in the air, flimsy against the weight of the evidence scattered before us. He turned to his wife, his face pleading. "You know why I did it. You know I wanted us to have a future." But she shook her head, her lips pressed tight. She stared down at her lap, fingers knotted together, unwilling to meet his eyes. He tried again, his voice rising. "Say something. Tell them I wasn't wrong." Still, she said nothing. The silence from the person closest to him broke something deeper than my accusations ever could. His chest caved inward, his shoulders folding as if the air itself pressed down too heavily to bear. Then he turned to his siblings. Desperation replaced pride. "You all grew up in this house. You know how hard it was. You know what he demanded from us. Don't pretend you don't understand why I wanted more." His younger brother's voice was steady, but his face was pale. "Wanting more isn't the same as stealing, not from Dad, not from Emily." Michael's mouth opened, then shut again. He looked at his eldest sister, his eyes wet, pleading for even a shred of understanding. But she leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her face hard. "You lied to me," she said. "You used me to turn against him. I will never forgive that." The words landed like stones. He winced, as though struck. His hands fell uselessly into his lap. The weight of rejection pressed him lower until he seemed smaller than I had ever seen him, no longer the confident man who had once commanded attention at this table, but a boy stripped of every illusion. His breaths came shallow, erratic. The sound of them filled the silence, uneven and fragile. At last he looked at me. His lips trembled, his voice breaking. "Dad, please, I was wrong. I don't know why I did it. I thought I was protecting us. I thought I deserved more. But now I've lost everything. The sight of him undone pierced me deeper than his betrayal ever had. This was my son, flawed, fallen, yet still mine. I felt the ache in my chest, the tightness of a heart torn between justice and love. I wanted to reach for him, to lift him as I once had when he stumbled as a child, but my hands remained still in my lap. The betrayal was too fresh, the wound too raw. Instead, I spoke with quiet steadiness. What you've lost is trust, and that is harder to rebuild than any company, any fortune. His head dropped, and a sob tore from him, raw and guttural. It echoed in the room, bouncing off the walls, cutting through the silence more painfully than any argument. One by one, the others rose from the table. My eldest daughter gathered the papers, her face pale but resolute. My younger son pushed his chair back, the scrape loud against the wooden floor. Their eyes no longer lingered on Michael, as though the man they knew had vanished. His wife rose last, slowly, her chair creaking. She looked at him one final time, her gaze filled with something colder than anger, disappointment. Then she turned and walked out, her heels tapping sharp against the floor. Michael remained seated, alone. His face crumpled, his body hunched. He looked like a man hollowed out, emptied of every mask he had once worn. I stayed seated, watching. My throat burned with words I couldn't speak, torn between the instinct to forgive and the need to let him face the weight of what he had done. The candles sputtered, their light wavering, shadows crawling up the walls. The meal lay untouched, the house eerily still, and in the center of it all sat my son, broken, exposed, and utterly alone. The days after the dinner felt strangely quiet, as if the house itself had absorbed the shock and settled into mourning. The laughter that once spilled through the rooms was gone. Conversations turned hushed, cautious, as though every word might reopen the wound that had split us. Michael did not return. His absence hung in the air like a shadow, heavier than his presence had ever been. His siblings went about their lives, but each carried the same look in their eyes, an ache that was part betrayal, part disbelief. I found myself sitting often in Emily's hospital room, her small breaths grounding me in a way nothing else could. The beeping of the monitors was steady, merciless, but it reminded me of why I had done all of this, why I had signed those papers, why I had endured the storm. Her fingers curled around mine when she stirred in her sleep, and I felt both fragile and unbreakable in the same moment. The consequences arrived swiftly. Word spread through the family's circle of friends and colleagues, quiet whispers at church pews, sidelong glances at the grocery store. My son's reputation, once polished and promising, dulled under the weight of what had been revealed. He left his job soon after, a resignation cloaked as necessity. His wife moved in with her sister. The separation was quiet, no announcements made, but the absence of her voice beside him spoke loudly. And Michael himself, I heard little. A rumor of him staying in a rented room on the edge of town. A neighbor mentioned seeing him at a bar, alone, hunched over a glass that never seemed to empty. Each fragment of news cut me in ways I could not admit to anyone. Because no matter what he had done, he was still my son. I wrestled with that truth each night. Lying awake, the ceiling fan spinning its endless circles, I asked myself if I had failed him. Had I worked too much, demanded too much, left too much unsaid when he was young? Did I build a company so tall that he could never find his own shadow within it? Regret pressed heavy against my chest. Yet at the same time, I knew forgiveness without responsibility was nothing but surrender. The family needed healing, but healing could not grow where rot was left unchecked, and so I shifted my gaze to the ones who had stayed. My eldest daughter visited more often, bringing meals in foil trays, her hands busy but her heart steady. She spoke less of anger now and more of moving forward. My younger son helped manage the endless paperwork for Emily's treatments, his tone practical but his presence a comfort. Together, we began to stitch something new, not the family we once were, but the family we still could be. It wasn't easy. The dinner table remained half empty, the space where Michael once sat glaring at us like a wound. But over time, the silences grew softer. Conversations returned, tentative at first, then warmer. Laughter even broke through now and again, surprising us with its resilience. The house smelled of fresh bread one morning when my wife baked for the first time in weeks. I stood in the kitchen doorway, the scent wrapping around me, and I realized we were still alive, still here, and I too had changed. For years, I had lived as if my worth was measured only by what I built, by the company's walls, by the contracts signed in my name. Selling it felt like tearing out my own heart. But watching Emily fight for each breath, watching my family fracture and struggle to heal, it taught me something I had refused to see. Legacy is not brick and mortar. It is not ledgers and balance sheets. Legacy is the strength we leave behind in the people who carry our name. I began to let go, not of responsibility, not of love, but of the need to control every corner of the world I had built. I let my children shoulder more, even when I feared they might stumble. I spoke more gently, listened longer. I looked them in the eyes and told them what I once assumed they already knew. I love you. I am proud of you. And in that openness, I found a kind of peace I had not known before. Michael remained absent, but I knew this story was not finished. The door to reconciliation was not locked, only waiting. Whether he chose to walk through it was no longer mine to decide. For now, the consequence of his choices was isolation, and for us, the consequence of mine was survival and perhaps in time, renewal. The road ahead was still hard. Emily's treatments continued, the bills never stopped, and the weight of loss lingered in the walls of the house. But in the midst of it, I felt a quiet strength growing, not in companies or fortunes, but in the fragile, stubborn threads of love that, though frayed, still bound us together. And maybe that was what true growth looked like. There are moments in life when the noise of the world falls away, and what remains is only the truth you cannot escape. For me, that truth came not in the form of contracts or signatures, not in the applause of a business built from nothing, but in the quiet rise and fall of my granddaughter's chest as she fought for another day. I had traded 20 years of labor for her chance at tomorrow. I had watched my family fracture, watched my son collapse under the weight of his own choices, and stood in the silence of a house that no longer sounded the same. And through it all, I kept asking myself, what is family? I used to think it was inheritance, the passing down of work, of wealth, of a name carved into wood and steel. I used to think legacy was something you could touch, something you could point to and say, this is ours. But I was wrong. Legacy is not in the buildings we raise. It is not in the fortunes we leave behind. Legacy is in the hearts of those who sit at our table. It is in the children who carry our stories, in the grandchildren who remind us what it means to hope, even when the world feels heavy. And family, true family, is not bound by blood alone. It is bound by love, by respect, by the willingness to show up when the storm rages. When my son betrayed me, I thought everything had been lost. I thought the years of sacrifice had been wasted, the love I poured out unnoticed, unreturned. But as the weeks passed, I saw something else. I saw my eldest daughter step into the role of protector, her hands steady as she helped me carry the weight I once held alone. I saw my younger son sit by Emily's bedside, his eyes filled with patience, his voice gentle as he read her stories late into the night. I saw my wife, weary yet unyielding, bake bread again for the family, filling the house with the smell of comfort, reminding us that even after fire, life can rise from ash. What I lost in one child, I found strengthened in the others. It does not erase the wound. It does not silence the grief. But it reminds me that love, when true, does not vanish with betrayal. It endures. I think often of Michael. I wonder if he sits alone at night, turning over the choices that led him here. I wonder if he hears the echo of our voices at the table, if he smells the faint trace of rosemary and candle wax, if he remembers the look in his siblings' eyes when the truth was revealed. I do not know if he will ever come back. I do not know if forgiveness will ever be possible. But I know this, the door will never be locked. He is my son. And though he has broken my trust, though he has turned away from the very values I tried to teach him, I cannot stop being his father. Forgiveness, if it comes, will not erase what was done, but it may give us both a chance to begin again. And perhaps that is the final lesson, that love is not blind, but it is stubborn. It holds on even when it has been hurt. It believes in the possibility of change, even when change feels impossible. As for me, I have learned to let go of the idea that my worth is tied to what I own. The company is gone. The building no longer carries my name. The trucks no longer run the routes I once mapped. But my life's work was never truly in those things. My life's work is sitting beside me now, in the form of a little girl who smiles despite the wires and tubes, whose laughter returns like sunlight breaking through a storm. My life's work is in the children who stayed, who still look to me not as a provider of wealth, but as a father who tried, imperfectly, painfully, but truly, to love them. And my life's work is in the lesson I now leave behind. That sacrifice without respect will break you. That love without honesty will blind you. And that family in the end is not who shares your blood, but who shares your table when the world feels hardest to bear. So if you are listening to this now, wherever you are, I ask you to remember one thing. Hold your family close. Not with possessions, not with promises of inheritance, but with presence, with patience, with love that does not ask for return. Because one day all the things we build can be sold, signed away, or forgotten. But the love we give, the nights we sit at a bedside, the meals we share, the forgiveness we choose to offer, that is what lasts. That is what makes us family. Thank you, my friends, for walking this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us, to subscribe to this channel, and to join our growing family here. Your support means more than you know. It allows us to keep sharing stories that remind us of what truly matters. I wish you health. I wish you peace. And most of all, I wish you a family that brings you strength, even in your hardest hours. Because at the end of everything, when all else falls away, it is love, and only love, that remains.